Welcome to the Filipino American Woman Project, a podcast that strengthens Filipino voices one conversation at a time through all things life, culture, and personal development. We're your hosts, Jen Amos and Nani Dominguez-Smith, and this episode is brought to you by our family on thenewfilipina.com. All right, let's go ahead and get into today's conversation.
All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the TFAW project. Although I don't need to say that because we have an intro and outro, a new one, by the way. We hope you all like it. We worked hard on that. So I'm excited because, since we've come back on the show. All right. So just as a recap, like last month, we had an exciting opportunity to talk about therapy for Filipino American women. And it was one, our opportunity to come back to the TFAW project, and two, invite people like past guests on our show to join us. And this month, Nani, it's no different because we are bringing back someone very special to you, someone who I highly respect and admire, and is the reason why we actually started our Chismis with Jen and Nani book club. So Nani, would you like to tell us a little bit about who this special person is and what do we have to share about her this month?
Back in the past. So you guys can do your own research and scroll through the TFAWproject.com archives to find her on there if you're interested. But she is also my best friend who just completed her master's program at San Francisco State University. And her thesis project was really highlighting the Filipino American experience through her dad's poetry. So her dad was a poet who had a master's degree in poetry from UC Irvine. And he was also a farm worker who grew up in rural California in Vacaville. I think that what she expressed in our discussion and just, in our lives in the past 15 years that I've known her is that her dad didn't talk a lot about that experience and about his experience growing up and about his family, about his culture. And I know that that's something we talk about with a lot of our guests in the TFAW project interviews that we've done is this disconnection, this intergenerational disconnection and kind of this resentment or, I think as a community, our generation has done a lot of work to understand why our parents and grandparents were so withholding about information that has to do with their upbringing and their experience, et cetera. And so this thesis project that she did for her master's program is really like an inside look into how she understands Filipino American history in the context of her dad's experience through this poetry that he wrote and didn't share with anyone. So, and she talks also in this discussion about how, one of the challenges that he had was getting his work published. And so this project is also an ode to him and just really a commemoration of his life and his effort and his talent, most of all, in poetry that now today is, going to be written in the history books for the next generation of Filipino Americans to learn from.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to listen to the first part of this conversation that you all are going to be able to hear in full here in a moment. And it just got me thinking about first and foremost, it touched my heart to hear that when we started our book club together and we read America is in the Heart by Carlos Bulosan, that was one of the defining moments for her to go down this path to learn more about her dad. And one thing she said in her conversation with you that resonated with me is how she felt like growing up, even though she was around other Filipinos, a lot of their parents were professionals, and she couldn't relate because, her dad was a farm worker. And so therefore, it's just, even though we have the same, we are of the same Filipino descent, I think what she was experiencing that I feel like I can articulate better because I also come from a family of farmers is a class difference, the class difference between even the Filipino culture. And I just remember even in going to college, and I just remember like whenever I'd be around other Filipinos who were like more ambitious, who were more studious, where it just seemed natural for them to like want to learn and be scholarly. I just couldn't like make the connection because it just wasn't something that I just came from a different background, like, and that's like I think that's what we hope to impress upon you in this conversation is like, even amongst the Filipino community, there are different, like, depending on what profession, your parents are, or the background they came from, how they immigrated here, it really shapes like your understanding of the world. And I know that there was one part where Caitilin said that, like, we don't really expect our parents when we're young, we don't expect our parents to have like a background story. Like we don't expect them to like have this whole life before us. They're just solely here to provide for us. And then we're frustrated when they cannot fulfill certain things for us. And I think what Caitilin did for herself, which I find inspiring and that I can relate to, is just like going back in history and like what a gift that she, even if her dad maybe didn't verbally talk about his experiences, what a gift it is that he left all these poems. And in a way, I feel like a part of my story is better understood. Part of my family story is better understood because of how is she sharing her dad's story in his poetry. Because, I can relate to her in a sense of that, like family history, stoicism, like not even talking about it because of the hard life that her family had lived. And I can relate to that in so many ways. And I just love how she just got a window into like that struggle through your dad's poetry. So I just think it, like I said, and I'm being repetitive here, but like it is a gift that was left behind, for her. And I can relate because like going back in time and trying to like understand like why we are where we are today, it's investigative work. You got to dig around and find things. And I can say the same even about my own family's history and how we had to like look up records, kind of what she talked about her dad's history, her grandpa's history. And so I'm just really excited to listen to this full conversation. I was able to listen to the first half of it, but also just, give like kudos to Caitilin for doing this work. And I think it's such a beautiful thing that what she originally wanted to do for her thesis, like ended up in honoring her dad's story, and amplifying his story, which is what we're all about here at the TFAW Project.
Yeah. Yeah. I think as a whole, we talk about often on the show, Filipino studies and Filipino American studies is an underrepresented topic in culture, in academia, in media, et cetera. That's why the TFAW Project exists, right? To highlight and represent, like amplify representation of Filipino American women. And also, on that note, Filipino Americans are not a monolith. Like you said, there's different caste systems, there's different social classes, there's different backgrounds that people come from. And I think that we're still very early on in the process of like uncovering these stories and documenting them and making sure that they're visible for the next generation to learn from and everybody else. But while we're doing that, there's still, these holes in our story that need to be filled in. And like you said, when you come from a background of a farm working family versus the background of like a political family or someone that is higher on the social hierarchy, so to speak, the representation gets less and less and less. And so I think that stories like these are really important. And like you said, this is a gift that, like the gift that keeps on giving. And personally, for me, it means a lot because I didn't know her dad, like I knew her when her dad was alive. He didn't pass until I had known her for like 5 or 6 years, but I didn't really spend any time with him. Like, I don't think I ever had a full on conversation with him. And so to get to know her, like this person, my best friend, the closest person to me for the last, for half of my life, essentially through these stories that her dad left, who had no clue that was going to reach an audience like this, is just really, really special. So I did just want to throw that in there as well.
Yeah. I do appreciate Caitilin. I feel like she is the voice to like families like me who do come from a farm working background. And if you've all followed her on our show, a lot of the conversations we've had with her have been in thenewfilipino.com, in our Chismes with Jen and Nani private podcast. But we do have her in one of our episodes. Just check the show notes of this episode and I'll be sure to list it in the resources. But one thing I've always been taken by is how eloquent and poetic, how charismatic she is. And, you know, I find it very reassuring. And again, I really connect to her own experience and her understanding of her dad and her dad's poetry, because we kind of relate on that level. Like I think we both really related in similar ways when we read America is in the Heart. So, you know, just a shout out to Caitilin and, you know, the scholarly work she's doing for this. Cause for someone like me, it makes me feel seen in that way, you know? And I think about like all the guests that we've interviewed. And again, a lot of them just have different, I mean, we all have a lot of different backgrounds. I mean, we all have a diversity of backgrounds, but it's nice that, like, you know, your best friend is someone that I feel like I can relate to. So I'm really excited to hear more about this thesis. And I know in an upcoming episode, we'll get more into it as well. But yeah, just shout out to Caitilin and shout out to you, Nani, for being by her side. And we'll probably talk more about this later, being by her side and helping her tell her story as kind of that in-person, boots on the ground facilitator, you know, for her.
Yes, thank you for saying that. I definitely have bared witness to, you know, the labor of love that this was for her to complete. As you guys are about to hear, you know, from her mouth directly, when she started her master's program, she got pregnant like in the same year. And so, of course, anyone who's a mom knows that that is really debilitating for any plans that you think you have for your life for at least, you know, a few years while you get acclimated to new motherhood and everything like that. So there's a lot of moving parts. And just the last thing that I want to say about how you mentioned how eloquent she is and well-spoken and just her natural storytelling abilities. The thing that I appreciate most about her using her dad's work in this thesis project is like you can draw a direct line of connection to where she gets that from. You can hear her like storytelling tendencies or instincts in her dad's poetry, which is amazing, you know, considering that we're not able to hear, you know, her dad speak his own poetry. Like you can hear him in her and vice versa. So I just think that's, again, really special. And we hope that you guys enjoy this as much as we did.
Yes. And if you enjoy this so much that you want to continue the conversation, just know that we will be inviting Caitilin into thenewfilipino.com. You all are welcome to join us on the platform for free to talk with her directly. So if at any point you listen to this recording, feel free to go to thenewfilipino.com and sign up for our free space. And we'll have Caitilin there answering any questions or responding to you if you have anything that you'd like to share with her. So, all right, Nani, well, let's dive in.
Okay, enjoy.
Okay, great. Well, first and foremost, welcome back to the TFAW project.
Welcome you back.
I know. Welcome
everyone. We're back.
And congrats on graduating.
Thank you, sir.
You recently graduated with your master's degree from SFU. Someone insert the round of applause.
That took me long enough, but you know, I get it.
Okay, well, why don't you tell us a little bit about that? First of all, we're here today to talk about your thesis project. And you chose to use this project to highlight your dad's story and talk about the larger Filipino American experience through poetry and art. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your thesis assignment?
Okay.
Like, what was the project?
Okay.
What was the prompt?
So this is kind of all interrelated. So I started my master's program in 2018, and this was the spring of 2018. So starting in January, the same semester that I began my master's program, I also found out I was pregnant. Like literally that month, I found out January I'm pregnant. I'm like one, month into my program.
Fun.
Super fun. And so I took a semester off after that. And while I was in my semester off, I'm preparing to come back after I just had my baby. And so I'm like prepping to get back into the program. I'm really excited and I'm doing my readings. And I think you'll remember this. And then one of the assigned readings prior to me coming back to the program is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. which is this book about colonialism, about European colonialism in Africa. And it's like this glorified book because essentially it's sardonic or sarcastic look or, you know, kind of a critique on European colonialism by a European. And that's supposed to be big news because it's like, oh, white people saying like, oh, being, you know, a white colonist and a white supremacist maybe isn't all that great. And so that's supposed to be like a big deal because like we're supposed to give them a, you know, a pat on the back because someone's doing that. And I took offense with that. I took offense with that perspective and I took offense to that reading because not only just kind of the subject matter, but then the writing and the language itself to me was explicit. The use of the N-word was on literally every other page. And this is a short story. This is probably like 70 pages long. And I'm reading this out loud to my newborn baby. So I'm prepping to come back to school and I used to really enjoy reading to Leroy when he was a baby. I thought it was coming for him, coming for me. And then all of a sudden I'm reading this and I'm like, I can't say the N-word to my beautiful new, you know, black baby. Like how disgusting. And I really just felt a way about it. And then, you know, literally the first day back in class, you know, everyone's like, okay, you know, like, welcome back. Like, let's discuss the reading. Like, let's get into it. And I'm like, let's. Like, mind you, I have a hard time, you know, like articulating myself because I didn't want to be like angry as fuck and I didn't really know what I was going to say. So like we're in class and everyone's discussing it. We're essentially supposed to do like kind of like blog posts that are like reflections on each of the reading that we turn in. And so I'm like angrily like typing away like this, like in the middle of class because I'm just like being disruptive and I'm like, fuck this whole conversation, fuck this book. And then my teacher's like, do you have something you want to say? And I'm like, matter of fact, like, and I almost start tearing up because I'm like, I was just so offended by this. And I think that there are so many other readings and there are so many other perspectives, let alone the perspectives of Africans who would give, you know, further insight into colonialism and that we don't have to continue to return to a white man's perspective on all subject matters. And she was like, oh, you know, like, that's interesting. Like, but, you know, I think, and everyone in the class was like, I think you're kind of like doing an emotional read on this. You're not being subjective. Like, the point of being an intellectual and an academic is that you're supposed to have, you know, an objective outlook on the information. And then you kind of like come to analysis and you synthesize that. And I was, whoa. And I was like, well, my analysis is that all of you are racist. None of you give a fuck. All of you hate black people. Like, well, and I'm literally like, we're going like back and forth.
Yeah, call me emotional. Watch me get emotional.
No, I'm emotional now. Like, and the girl who's leading the assignment, like, she had even, like, prefaced the whole assignment, like, I signed up for this because this is my favorite book of all time, like, blah, blah, blah. And so now she's like, I'm feeling personally attacked, like, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I'm feeling personally attacked. Like, I'm trying to read this book out loud to my child and, like, to my family who are black. And, like, this is fucking uncomfortable for all of us.
Yeah, and not just the language, like you said. The context which was used was just inappropriate.
And even to, like, even further, the assignment itself. Like, okay, so
what were we supposed to be learning?
Why, you professor, like, you know, what was the intent of you assigning this? You know, it's one thing for this to have been like the prevalent attitude in the fucking late 1800s, but for 2018, for my professor to assign this as like, this is the dominant authority on this subject matter was, I took it not necessarily, well, yes, I took it the wrong way. And I was like upset because I'm like, there's more out there. Like, why are we not, you know, if we're talking about being intellectuals and being academics, why are we not,
why are we not welcoming disagreement or challenging perspectives?
And so basically the consensus was in that class was that I should read around the words that I don't like. Like, if I took issue with the N-word, I should read around the N-word and, like, you know, like, read the rest of the content. And I was like, well, if the point was that I was supposed to read this book and I'm supposed to read all the language in this book, I'm critiquing all of the language in this book.
Yeah.
The N-word first and foremost. And then secondly, the fact that I'm supposed to use this as informative and informative in a way that's supposed to be like
beneficial to my learning.
Yeah. And to an extent it was, because now I've found out a lot about, you know, like this was like really just like kind of like ripping the mask off of my education. And I further like took issue with it because I was doing my program at San Francisco State University. We're in the Bay Area, and San Francisco, SFSU, has the country's first ethnic studies program.
And best.
And I'm over here thinking like, you know, this is like a liberal arts program and a liberal community, like, and all of a sudden I'm feeling like I'm the odd, like
I'm the outsider for having this perspective.
For caring about ethnic perspectives. And so I just really, really felt so uncomfortable after that. And it just really like, it just, for me, I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm not in like this like safe, happy environment. And you know me, I love school, I love academia. And like, I was so happy to be in that program. And all of a sudden I felt like this just sucks, like all the way around. I hate it here now. Like I wanted to transfer to an ethnic studies program.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of conversations and a lot of conflict about that because I was like, I can take two routes. So I can go into an ethnic studies program and I can feel comfortable. I can feel like I'm really learning what I want to learn. Or I can thug this out and essentially be the change that I want to see in the world.
Yeah.
And me, like my secret desire is to be like, a late night, like vigilante justice, superhero. Yeah. To go around like fighting crime. And so I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to change everyone's mind here. And I'm going to like open up their attitudes to see like, ethnic studies and ethnic perspectives, they matter, they're valid, and they're just as credible, as these fucking ancient white heteronormative perspectives.
Okay, wait. Pause for a moment to clarify what your major was.
Thank you. I was a humanities major at SF State.
Okay.
And we have had conversations in the past with Stacey, who I think she had kind of like a similar experience when she first started out, where she was doing something, I think like classical studies or something like that. And then it just turned out not to be what she thought.
Yeah.
And basically what I was sold on that humanities program was that I was going to be looking at arts and culture from a broad scope, like throughout history, throughout the world. And I was going to get like a magazine approach to arts and culture. And that was really exciting to me because I love museums, I love history, I love arts and culture. So I was like, yes, I'm going to get to learn it all, the best of it all. And then come to find out the best of it all in like the Western world, a Western perspective. And I was like, okay, I'm going to dismantle this. Like this is going to be my MO while I'm here in school. And then when I finished my program work, it was time to do my thesis. And I was like, okay, I'm really going to like buckle down on what I have to say. And like, like this whole, MO, this mission that I'm on, to expand ethnic studies appreciation in the humanities. But that was really hard for me because I just felt really like, honestly, like scared and vulnerable about the approach I was going to take because of the experiences I had had with my professor and with my colleagues that I felt like, oh, like, are they even going to find this credible? And I felt like I had to do like so much work, like literally define like what is white supremacy, what is racism, and like why does it matter? I felt like I had to argue that point
to define this.
Yeah, and I felt like I had to. Yeah, because clearly when I was having that conversation, I was having to define that. Like people were literally saying to me in that class, racism has existed for 300 years. Like, why do you think like you're going to change it or what's going to change? Or like, why would that, matter? And I'm like, well, to people who have been affected by racism, even the smallest, most incremental changes matter. Like the small wins are
the only way that you change things is through small incremental changes.
And she was like,
yeah.
And I was like, yeah, like the fact that
what seems obvious to me is so like,
I was blindsiding them. Like we, on both ends of the spectrum, we felt blindsided. And that was really discomforting to me.
Yeah.
And so I really had a hard time approaching like how I was going to confront that. At first, I was clearly in attack mode because I felt attacked. So I felt like, okay, like I can't tell you how many versions of a thesis I wrote. Like I wrote so many different versions of like, first I started off like, okay, my thesis is really going to center on Joseph Conrad and like an attack on him. And like, I was going to do a contrast and comparison with, Joseph Conrad's work and the work of like authoritative sources that could essentially like give like a full context of, what was going on at the time. But I just wasn't really happy with it. Like I just felt like it wasn't necessarily like authentic to what I cared about. I just felt like I was really just like trying to prove a point, this specific point. And then I realized, okay, like, then I had to start working. So I finished my program in 2020, the program work in 2020. And I was like, okay, the program is done. I need to make money. So I'm going to start working. I ended up going into nonprofits. And then it just like kind of furthered me away from like taking the time to sit down and write. But in the meantime, I'm just thinking like, like what matters to me? Like I'm curious about ethnic studies, but like what exactly do I want to say? Also, parallel to all of this, my father had passed at this point, probably like 4 years prior to this. I had Lil when I was 26. My father passed away when I was 21. So this was like about 5 years out from my dad's passing, and which had always been on my mind, continues to be on my mind all the time. And so I'm starting to think about, okay, I want to study authoritative ethnic studies perspectives. Where in ethnic studies do I feel like I have an authoritative perspective? Well, like I'm Filipino, so like let's get into that. Because now that I think about it, I honestly don't know much about that. I don't know much about my own family history. I don't know much about Filipino American history. I don't know much about Filipino history. And then I'm thinking about like, okay, like why is that? Like that doesn't seem to be, just a coincidence that I know nothing about this. I don't really haven't had that much exposure to ethnic studies other than, what I've gone out of my own way personally to find out.
Yeah.
And then clearly everyone around me, specifically white people, are also not getting that same exposure to ethnic studies. Like, why is that the case? And so I'm like, okay, so like maybe this is the mission that's right for me. And so like I said, I want to learn more about Filipino American history. I start with my own family because that's, you know, to me, like the most pertinent, obviously, information. Like when I'm thinking about Filipino American history, like how does it even,
It's the best way to make meaning of any information that you're trying to process is through your personal experience and your personal background.
So I'm like, okay, let's look into my own family history. What's going on here? And one of the places that I started was with my father's poetry. So my father had been a poet. That was like something that I was very aware of as I was growing up. He was writing as I was growing up. And it was the impetus for him getting a higher education. So he started off, my family's from Fairfield, first generation, they're from Fairfield, Fairfield, California. Hey. And he went to Solano College, which is right across the street from where we grew up. And while he was there in college, he had an English professor who noticed that he had a talent for writing, poetry specifically. And that professor, you know, mentioned to him, like, you know, you could really get a scholarship for doing, you know, this type of work, for pursuing this. And he ended up receiving a scholarship to UC Irvine, which is where he met my mom. And then from there, not only was he the first in his family to get a higher education, a college education, he went on to get a master's education, another scholarship after finishing his studies at UC Irvine. He went to Boston College and then ended up graduating from, I should know this. I think I'm going to have to text my mom. We're going to find out.
Fill this in later.
We'll find out later. TBD for more. And then I'm thinking about that, like, oh, that's actually a really big deal. Like, you're a first generation.
It's a huge
deal. You're a first generation.
And wait, let's just back up for a second.
Yeah.
Is your dad first generation? What is his migration story or his family's migration story from Philippines to America?
So both my grandparents are from Pangasinan. My grandpa was the first to emigrate. He came over here. I found when I was doing my thesis research, I found a census document that I think dated him in Suisun County in 1930. It's either 1930 or 1940.
Wow, that's so cool.
So fucking cool. Yeah, I have it somewhere and I'll share it with you. But it was essentially a census document that listed all these farm workers that were the owner of the farm had to essentially fill out this census document that said who was working, when, their ages, etc. So I found out that he was here in either 1930, 1940, and that would have aged him at 18 years old at the time.
Okay.
So my grandfather came out here from the Philippines as a teenager, you know, in the beginning of the 20th century by himself.
Like through military or
by himself? It was prior to that. So I think he even came while he was still a national because the Tidings-McDuffie Act, I think, happened in 1934. So he was able to come when when Filipinos were still able to have like that national citizenship, coverage. And so I believe he came under that umbrella, came directly, I think, through Angel Island, came to Northern California. And what was interesting for me, especially to see that document, was that he's really been in Fairfield for this long. You know, I think about like
Bay Area Filipinos. We're out here. Well, is Fairfield the Bay Area?
Ask them; they will tell you.
Extended Bay Area.
Say otherwise. Like,
I'm pretty sure the Bay ends in like Vallejo, but we'll give it to you. Fairfield's
right next door. Bitch, like no. Okay.
I'm pretty sure that's like Sacramento County. Okay, but it's all good. You know. Sisters.
We're out here. So my grandfather, and that was really cool for me to see as well. Like, you know, you think so much like, okay, I relate so much of our family history to be like immigrant history, but then you really think about it. Like, my grandpa was out here since he was a teenager. Like, he was here, you know, 18 onwards. Like, he's more American than he is anything else. You know, he's really like, he created, you know, he set up his roots here. The first time he bought a home, like his family, his wife, like all of that happened here in America. So my grandfather came out here when he was a teenager. He did end up participating in World War II. And then my grandmother was a war bride from that. So I think his time he spent back in Pangasinan, he ended up marrying my grandmother through an arranged marriage. And I think which was also a culture shock to her because back in the Philippines, she grew up middle class. So her family owns. My grandfather did not, was very much grew up in poverty. His father died the same year he was born. And I think she was I want to say somewhere between 8 to 12 kids. And so he pretty much very much figured it out on his own, came out here to, you know, that's our origin story. So he brings my grandmother back and then she goes from being middle class to farm work in America for 9 to 12 hours a day.
Such an important point to make.
Yes. alongside her husband and alongside her 7 children. So her and her 7 children are working day in, day out. This is a total...
And now they're separated from the rest of the family who probably was able to help a lot more than the support that they have here in California.
And so it's like, not only do we not have support, not only am I just having, a culture shock in general, I'm living in a totally different country. Like, I'm not able to phone home. Like, all these things are different. And then I'm also living somewhere that is incredibly hostile to who I am inherently as a person, something I can't change. My identity as a Filipino, as a Filipina, it's not safe to be in America.
Yeah.
And so that's very much the environment that my father was born into. He was born in 1954. So this is 10 years prior to the Civil Rights Act. So we're living in very much a segregated, racist, systemically racist environment. And once again, to kind of continue the thread of thinking like, oh, the Bay Area has always been, this liberal, diverse community. And it very much has been a diverse community, as we can see, since 200 years ago. That doesn't not mean that it wasn't also very racist, very hostile, and that it's honestly related to how diverse it's always been. So where we're from is like Chinese Americans or Chinese people have lived out here for hundreds of years. Filipinos have been here for hundreds of years. Japanese have been here for hundreds of years. And this is also the same time, like right after the Civil War, where Black people are also emigrating out of the South, coming to California. And so it's very much a mixed environment. But then at the same time, obviously, white people are feeling hostile to this diversification. And, they're feeling very threatened, especially obviously in terms of like their job security and the economy. So all of this is happening at once. This is the world in which my father is born into. And as you can imagine, this is obviously a very hostile environment, not just externally towards their family, but something that I talk about in my thesis is how that was normalized and internalized. Mm-hmm. So part of the reason why, I felt such a blank space about my own family history was because our family history, our family origins weren't discussed. My grandfather had actually passed away before I was born. He died farm working in Lodi, California. He was, I believe, just on the cusp of 70 years old. I think he was 69 when he died of a heart attack, harvesting asparagus.
Wow.
Yeah. And so he passed before I was born. And then I think, that was something that I've had glossed over in my entire childhood. Just like, oh, that kind of makes sense. Like if you're doing hard work, you could possibly have a heart attack. Like those two things seem to be compatible. But what I was underappreciating was, why was he subject to that hard work, especially at the age he was? Like, why was my grandfather working as a farm worker at 70 years of age? You're a retired veteran. Like, you should, presumably have, certain comforts, like certain benefits that you had come into in your lifetime. Like, why was it that you're still...
So was he one of the Filipinos that enlisted to serve on behalf of the U.S. Army, but then was denied his benefits later?
Yes.
Okay, because that's also something we've talked about pretty extensively in the show.
So absolutely, that was the case. He was able to somehow, some way, get a loan to create our home in Fairfield. Our home, he purchased the land and he had that built. And we actually have, I have the ledgers for that, like the blueprints and the original paperwork, from the 1950s for when that was happening, but no benefits. And then afterwards, it was really hard for him to find job security. So something that, I think also why I was very quiet, or why I felt like my personal background in that family story was silenced, was that it had both been silenced by my grandfather, who just didn't feel comfortable, talking about his experiences.
Yeah. Hello, PTSD.
Yeah, no, seriously. And I just felt, also for me, I felt like growing up, I had a very unique, but very an outcast Filipino American background. A lot of my friends and family, or a lot of the people that I grew up with, obviously, we're here in the Bay Area, so I know plenty of Filipino people, but a lot of them come from medical backgrounds, or they have very much very comfortable middle class backgrounds. And even when you and I became friends, your grandpa, obviously by no means they weren't wealthy or anything like that, but it was a much warmer, more comfortable environment than what I had been used to. And so I really wanted to kind of peel back the layers as to why, honestly, just my family history was just so cold. Why is it so cold? Why are we not talking about this? Why is there not?
I wouldn't say cold. I think there's a disconnection.
Yeah.
An intergenerational disconnection.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I feel that, to me, that was related to a sense of just a coldness that I felt. There wasn't there.
So you had to go and dig through, like find actual government files to find out this information about your family because you couldn't have the conversation.
Exactly. And I was like, why is that? So why was it that between my father and I, we had never really had conversations about his family history, his upbringing? Like, I honestly learned a lot more about his upbringing through my mother and like the stories she would tell me. And all she would just repeat was like, your father grew up with a very hard life. Like, he grew up very hard. And like the few memories or like the few experiences that he ever shared with me were just kind of like very offhand, where it'd be like, I remember one time we were grocery shopping and like there was a minute when I was like super into Wonder Bread because I just loved like how soft it was. And he told me, exactly. And he told me the story of like, oh yeah, like growing up, like this was our favorite snack. Like we used to like take Wonder Bread and like ball it up and then we would just like eat it. And like that was like a treat for us. And I was like, okay, noted. Like, you know, like that was like a treat for you. Breasts.
Telling what your life
what your life was like. Okay. So I'm like putting together little pieces. And like my grandfather, my father, as I mentioned, was also a farm worker. And that started when I started to revisit his poetry. Come to find out he was doing that work starting at age 5 or 6. And so alongside, and he's one of 7. So alongside his siblings, who are also, he's the third eldest, so that means he had younger siblings who were then working younger, because he, in this what bone he has, young hands, young fakes, he identifies his age at being around age 6, and he is there, and he starts it with like, you know, we're leaving at the end of the day's work, I'm in the front of, you know, our father, you know, like meet up truck. And then all of my brothers and sisters are sitting in the back, but they're all like laying on the bottom of the truck bed because they don't want anyone from in town or like their school friends to see them working and like leaving work while they're all enjoying their summer and enjoying helping children.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we're working and essentially, AKA, we're poor. And like, you know, then now it's really, I feel like, I think sometimes, you know, when you're kids, it's hard to really like humanize your parents because you're like, oh, they're not like people. They're like, their parents, you know, like they're not like, they don't matter. Like they don't have like real backgrounds and history. Like they just live
to serve. Keep you alive.
Yeah. Like, you know, like that's your whole job and your identity is like doing for me.
Yeah. You have no other purpose here on this earth other than to cater to us.
And then, so I'm like, oh, okay. Like, you know, now that I'm thinking about it, like when hearing about that you had a hard life, like, wow, that sucks. Like to really think about like what does that mean?
You
like,
see him in a different light.
I'm seeing you in a different light.
And the fact that he didn't tell you this directly. You're learning this through something that he wrote when he was 5 years old, or you know, however.
On reflection. And I'm reading all this and doing this research after you passed as well. So
like, so I can't even ask you questions or
Yeah. And so now I'm like just like kind of peeling back the layers and really starting to identify and appreciate just what exactly our upbringing or like our origin and our family story was like. And then I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, like if my father's like, was this difficult? You know, what was it like for my grandfather, you know, my grandmother, like the first to be here? And to, you know, if my father grew up in the 1950s, you know, 10 years prior to, you know, the Civil Rights Act and for, you know, all of these like civil rights movement, the American Civil Rights Movement, what was it like when no one gave a fuck? You know what I mean? When it's absolutely like, it's totally okay to be racist. Like, you know, you're driving through town and it's saying no Filipinos allowed. Like, no, dogs are Filipinos, you know, at this, you know, business. And so obviously, you know, we think about that history, but to us, I feel like it's very solidified. It's very hard in the past. But then when you start to place that and contextualize it with people you love, now it's like really hitting home and it's resonating. And so I started to really feel like, okay, there's something here. Like I want to discover this. I want to talk about this. And I think that using my father's poetry as an entry point is the perfect way to do this because it humanizes this experience. And like, it was also very informative for me to find out that our experiences and our background and our history of as being farm workers was not something that was as niche as I had originally thought it was. And a lot of that came to light through, you know, working with the TFAW project. And, you know, I think one of the first conversations we had was like when Jen and I kind of had that moment where we both identified with that. And she was saying like, oh yeah, my group, you know, same. And then, you know, I started to do more reading. And I think what really kind of like broke the seal for me was when I read America's in the Heart by Carlos Velosa. And then I read it. I remember reading it honestly right around my father's birthday in October. And as I was finishing it, like I remember reading the last chapter in tears. And I was like, just like bawling, crying, because to me, I'm a reader. I love to read. And by far, that was the saddest book I've ever read.
Yeah. And you're probably imagining like your father and your grandfather's experiences as you were reading it.
And it made now like a light bulb went off in my head, because for me, what was just so sad and heartbreaking about America's in the Heart was that it was just probably like the loneliest, bleakest narrative I've ever read, where it's just like so hopeless. Like there was absolutely no hope. There was no warmth. There like were no warm moments in that book. Like there was like literally nothing, but it read almost like a history because it was so just dry and bare bone. I was like, these things happen, but there was like hardly any moments of like camaraderie or friendship, because it was like, we're working all day, we're starving, we're homeless.
That was the reality.
That's the reality
of their experience.
And something that really hit home for me also was that, you know, as opposed to, and I think about this a lot, where, you know, I think you introduced me to this term where it's like, I forget what it's called, but it's like something like Olympics, where, you know, people like, you know,
oppression
Olympics, where, you know, like people, you know, want to compare like, oh, you know, this history is more oppressive than this history.
My community is more traumatized than yours. Yeah.
And for me, specifically what stood out was like that there was just there was no warmth, I think, in the Filipino American history. And I think for that, like specifically, I related that to the fact that it was very much a bachelor society. And I was thinking about that when I was reading about, you know, Carlos Glossat's history, and I was thinking about my grandfather, and I'm thinking very much about how it's just like all these men who are coming out here and they're going to live and die alone. And that's going to be the
And to think about how he ended up with your grandma. If she was a war bride, he went back to the Philippines to marry her from an arranged marriage. At the time, like in Americans in the Heart, they talk about extensively how they would go to the dance halls. Like going to the dance halls after work was the thing to do, but they weren't allowed to talk to the white women. They weren't allowed to dance with the white women. You know, there was no chance of them making any connection.
Any connections. Or even if they did, that's not real. You're literally paying for that connectivity.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it really opened my eyes to, okay, when I was referencing, you know, that feeling of like coldness or that feeling of emptiness, like I'm like, oh, I kind of see where that comes from. Like you know, your surroundings and the way you grew up
made you cold.
Made very cold. And so even when warmth came into your life as in like a family or wife, like, and it's an arranged marriage, you know, and like I said, I brought up my grandma's history because she comes out here and she's like, you know, what the fuck is this? Like, what type of life is this? And I think there was some resentment and there was some just kind of like depression on all sides, the children, the mom, the dad. No one was living a quality of life, a substantial quality of life. And I think, you know, those are from accentuating circumstances, like that was pressed upon them, that if that's what you live with, you internalize your environment. Like we are all products of our environment. So if you're living in a hostile environment, you're living in an environment that's cold to you, you're living in an environment that says you're worthless, that you don't matter, you shouldn't have rights, you shouldn't vote, you shouldn't be a citizen, your kids don't matter, put them to work, you're 5 years old, oh, well, hurry it up, pick it up, like, come on, you know, you're on the clock.
Yeah.
You internalize that, and you internalize that as a child. And I think about especially my dad and his siblings, like, you know, working all day long. And like, you know, at the end of the day, you know, you're looking for warmth, but your parents are also depleted. You know, your mom isn't here to like give hugs and like, you know, make your bath because there's fucking 7 of you. And she's also been working all day long. And like, my grandpa's just like, as soon as he heads home, you know, I think about like, you know, I don't want to, you know, play like ego politics and like make excuses, you know, for like his ego, what it must have felt like as a man to like not be able to be a provider for your family. But I do think that, like, you know,
whether you want to think about it, it plays into the story.
Exactly. Yeah. And especially it's the 1950s, you know, so you're a man who has 7 children. You brought your wife over from the Philippines to give her this American life. She probably has certain expectations of what that's going to be like.
And it turns out to be worse than what she started with.
Yeah. And so I think he probably also internalized feelings of disappointment. So like, I'm sure his children were disappointed that, you know, they're literally hiding in the back seat because they're disappointed that they have to work. Your wife is unhappy at home because she's disappointed that she's living the life that she has to live. And you're thinking about, oh, I'm the impetus for all this because I came here, I started this life, I started our family, and I'm not doing enough. So
yeah.
No one is happy. No one is happy. And if there's no happiness at home, what does that breed? Especially in children. And so now I'm getting a fuller look at my father's life. And disclaimer, you know, my father ended up passing away in relation to his depression, which manifested in his alcoholism. And so for me, now all these threads are coming together. I'm seeing like, okay, especially I was wondering, you know, like, why is it that the Damacions are dying? Like, why are they dying off, especially at an early age? My dad died when he was 59. My grandpa died when he was 69. And my grandma died the week after my dad died. And so I'm thinking about, you know, like, these premature deaths. I'm thinking about the unhealthy circumstances in which all these deaths are related. Like, you're dying of a heart attack at work. You're dying of alcoholism related to depression. My grandmother died of sepsis, which is an easily curable disease. So it's just like, what are the circumstances in which your health doesn't matter? Therefore, your humanity, yourself doesn't matter. Like, why would you not be caring enough to take the steps to initiate care for yourself? And that's because, the environment that you live in is telling you that you don't matter. And so I'm like, okay, now I've gathered all this information about Filipino American history. I've gathered all this personal data about my family. What do I want to do with it? And I decided, like, as opposed to, where it originally started when I was in my program where I was really upset, I'm like, okay, I'm going to take the opposite approach because being upset really scared me off from even writing about what I wanted to say. I'm going to take a celebratory approach. I'm going to take a positive approach. And so my thesis ended up really being, for me, a way to kind of put to bed a lot of this depression that was intergenerational, because even for myself, obviously my father passed away when I was 21 years old. He died of circumstances that were by no means positive or peaceful. And obviously that took an effect on me.
That was a traumatic
experience for me. Yeah. And it ended up breeding depression in me. So I'm like, okay, how can we turn this story around for our family, but also...
I love that.
Yeah, you know what I mean? And also in relation to, this wasn't just...
We can reframe the narrative. Mm-hmm. In a lot of ways, what I'm hearing is this thesis, or your choice to incorporate your dad's story in your thesis, is you changing the narrative for your family who just couldn't.
Yeah,
for all of these reasons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they just couldn't. I think also because, I'm blessed to come up in a place and time, where we're not there yet, where, everyone is accepted and everyone, we're living in a fully inclusive world, but it is much more inclusive. I am able to go to school, I am able to study what I want to study.
You're not working on
exactly.
5 years old.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, I'm blessed to be in this situation. And come to find out, these circumstances aren't just particular to me and my family. This is very much in context of Filipino American history, let alone the history of America's systemic racism. So I want to, just help celebrate us and validate us. And I want to I want our family to feel good, but I also want to, help support Filipino Americans feeling good about themselves and their identity, because it's clearly not just a matter of, I didn't know my own history because my family didn't talk about it. You never studied Filipino American history in school. I never studied it in school. So many people didn't study in school. Why is that? Why are other Filipino American families not talking about their history? Why are Filipino Americans as a whole not talking about their history? What has stopped us or prevented us from doing so? And why have we normalized that is
not doing it?
Yeah. And so I'm like, okay, we're going to take a celebratory approach, starting with, we're going to say, that, this history is here, whether it's not, celebrated and it's not a common thing. It does exist. Our history does exist. And our arts and our culture does exist, and I'm lucky enough to have my father's poetry as evidence of that. And he started writing in the 70s, and he wrote prolifically through the early 2000s. And then he had a depressive period where he just stopped altogether, very much, in train with who he was. But I'm like, okay, so, I'm going to, help evidence the fact that we have been here, we exist, and we have shit to offer. And it's good. It's good stuff. So I am going to use his poetry as an entry point. And then I'm going to say, okay, this is what my father said. These were his experiences. And this is how this relates to Filipino American history as a whole.
Okay.
And so I start with the poem Asparagus, which is a poem that talks about my grandfather's death. So then I start talking about the history of Filipino Americans in this country as farm workers and how that started. Then I moved to Young Hands, Young Face, which I reference, which talks about my father now being in the picture, and then the siblings and them growing up, and why, even a generation and from the 1930s to the 1950s, what's happening there. And then I move on, and my father has, a few pieces about, him being a teenager or a young man. And so then I kind of contextualize that, what were the developments? What's happened since then? Since Larry Isliong has come and gone, what were the civil rights that have made space or have made developments or evolution possible for Filipino Americans? And then I end with a poem called Canciones, which to me is in some ways one of my favorite poems that he wrote, because though throughout all of his poetry is kind of very melancholic, it is, as you can hear, like he suffered depression, so he was very much not the happiest guy, and that is, you can see that
it doesn't have the most optimistic.
It's not, joyful, but this was the one poem where he is almost on the edge of being like, there's definitely like some nostalgia, there's like some sentimentality, and there's almost like a little bit of like, he's looking back on his life as a farm worker, and he is like now looking at it in the sense of like, he's like, the poem is about him or himself. A lot of his poetry was autobiographical about him reflecting on, these new golf courses and these new malls that have sprung up in Fairfield. And he's saying these were this used to be where we used to work. Like these used to be orchards. Like this used to be where I grew up. And he's almost taking that authority. Like he's this close to taking authority on his history and being prideful of it. He's like so close to having pride in who he was and in his history. And I kind of end with that poem because I'm like, what if, like if he had taken that pride, if he had taken that step to be like, being a farm worker mattered. Like it was a part of our history. Like it wasn't just you. Like that's what set us up as Filipino Americans in America. That was our origin story.
Yeah.
And, what would have made the difference if you had taken pride in your story, even if to you it wasn't obviously, the sexiest or, the wealthiest or like
the most joyful experience.
No, it did matter. And like why, for you to say like, Filipino American lives matter. Like, what would that have done for you personally? Yeah. Would you still be here today? What would that have done for our grandfather? Like, what would that do essentially for the Filipino American community if we said our lives matter, our history matters?
Yeah. Again, what meaning are you making of your experience? And obviously that was really hard for him to see because he didn't grow up in an environment that primed him to think that larger than what was right in front of him, which was this really like not fun, not joyful experience.
Yeah.
So for you to do that for him and for your family is super radical. Yeah. And for it to come from a place, the initial like conflict that you had in this classroom and wanting to initially attack on that and then reframing it and saying, how can I make meaning of this personally and switch the narrative so that I'm effectively communicating, initially how they were saying, oh, well, read around the words that you don't like or read around the parts that are offensive to you. Okay, so this is how I'm doing it.
Yeah. And so I guess like my full circle moment was that, this was the thesis that I finally submitted and that helped me to graduate, which was, one check off the list. And then also, so since I've graduated, I told myself like, okay, like I'm not just going to stop here. Like I want this, if I really want to be impactful, I want to do my utmost to, just deepen this impact. And how can I do that? So I decided, okay, I'm going to make a pop-up exhibit of this because I really want Filipino Americans to take up space. Like I really want us to take up space and to really enjoy being Filipino Americans. And so I created and set up this exhibit. And in the process of doing so, I've been doing all this outreach, embarrassing myself, and reaching out to looking people I went to high school with and everybody to this program just because I'm trying to, fill it up. And I'm talking to my teacher, my professor who helps me to graduate. And I gave her the flyer and I'm like, oh, can you share this with anyone who might be interested? And she was like, yes, I'd be happy to share this. As a matter of fact, I am now assigning and teaching your father's poetry in my humanities class. Yes,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, she just told me that last week and she was like, can you come back in November, when we're teaching it? And I literally, once again, started crying because I was like, wow, this means everything to me. This is exactly like,
well, when you talk about making meaning of what you're doing and what you're, the efforts that you're putting in, for you, it feels like this started as a really like cathartic process for you to heal this like conflict and like discomfort that you felt from the classroom incident or whatever. And now look how it's manifesting.
Exactly. And like how you just mentioned, to take that celebratory approach and see, what is the outcome of that, as opposed to just saying like, okay, I want the point of this to be to make a point that, you did something nasty. And I was like, okay, then what? So like, what are your solutions? And so I bypassed, the attack approach and went, straight to the end point of being like, Filipino American history and culture matters. And it's great. And by doing that, I bypassed, having to do the back and forth. And she was just like totally receptive and being like, because even as, we were going through the process of me, finishing my thesis and editing my thesis, she was really struck by my father's poetry. And that was really cool for me to see
someone else be impacted.
Yeah, to be impacted. Because I'm over here, to me, obviously it's so personal. So I'm like, this is everything to me. But for someone else to read it and just to read it objectively and be like, wow, this is good writing, like blah, blah, blah. But then to take it a step further. And one of the reasons reasons that my father actually stopped writing was he really had a hard time getting published. And he, something that I talk about, throughout this thesis is, what are the effects of depression? It makes you less optimistic. And therefore, if you're less optimistic, you're less able to, move upward socially, like social mobility. It becomes less of a possibility because you just have no ambition, you have no drive, you have no motivation because you're so beat down.
Yeah.
And so he was unable to really, take his work to the next level that he wanted to see in the world. But the beauty was that he did the work anyway. So it's here and it exists. And as his daughter, I was able to not just take on this personal project of saying like, Dad, like your life mattered. Like it mattered to me. Like, I really want you to rest in peace and know, like, I see you. I understand you now. Like, It's okay. Like, I love you. It all happened for a reason. Like, it's okay. Like, I really just personally wanted to do that to,
validate
to give him that,
existence.
to feel that for myself, like it's okay. But then to come and find out, like not just only is it okay, but like it's great. Like what you did was actually like this really big accomplishment. And now to have a professor at a university, specifically at this university that that I have both had issue with, but also still remains to be this historic university, especially considering ethnic studies.
Yeah,
especially considering Filipino American studies, which San Francisco State really has like a storied Filipino American Studies department and professors for my dad's poetry to now be being taught there is like, wow, like if he knew that, he would be like, I can't even imagine, how he would feel about that.
Yeah.
And to know that the reason that was possible was because his daughter like worked her ass off, to do all this work, because obviously it wasn't easy. It took me years. I had to like do the writing, the research.
Yeah. But it ended up being this really full circle, like healing process moment of validation, not just for you and healing this like conflict that you had in the classroom, but for your dad who dealt with depression, for your grandpa who came here and was dealing with all of this, being beat down, trying to be the man for his family and everyone else involved. So that's really powerful.
Yeah. And I felt like I had also really completed this mission of, when I first started out struggling in this humanities program of saying like, they're not appreciating authoritative ethnic perspectives. And for now to come full circle and like that's exactly what's happening. I felt like in my experience, there was such a dearth of exposure to Filipino American studies in the humanities. And now they're teaching Filipino American culture and poetry in this same humanities program where I felt like that was missing. And the Filipino American culture that they're teaching just happens to be, my own family is my father's. And so I was like, this is just like
a huge win.
This is such a win. And like, she didn't even tell me, like, before I like emailed her and she was like, oh, by the way, like, we're studying his stuff. And I'm like, oh my God. And like, I went over to my mom's house last night and I told her that. And like, she was like, oh. So, and then like to keep it even, and all this has happened even before, the event has launched. And the pop-up has launched itself. So it's like, I feel like this has literally, completed itself before it's even started. And what I'm really looking forward to now is I'm going to obviously be inviting my son. And like the fact that, he's going to see, mommy doing this and like mommy, like people really paying attention to what mommy has to say specifically as a Filipino American, and like to see like, oh, that's like my grandpa up on the wall. Like people are here, like, looking at his story. Like now, not only have I healed our story, now I'm really setting the tone for a new narrative and acceleration in our own family.
Instead of passing on that depressive tone.
Yeah, or to say you don't matter, we don't talk about it. Now it's like there's people talking about it.
Yes.
Yeah. So I feel really happy about that.
So basically the hard work is done and this traveling exhibit is now the celebration.
Yeah.
This is the fun part.
Yes. This is the fun part.
Remind yourself of that in 2 weeks, because at the time of this recording, we are still 2 weeks out from the launch of the exhibit. But I do want to read an excerpt from your little marketing materials here. And then you could tell us a little bit about your plans for the exhibit. So much of Filipino American culture remains a general mystery. There's little record of our history, though it reaches over 4 centuries deep. This silence bears significant criticism that is richly rewarded with stories of adventure, heartbreak, empire, and rebellion. In For Those Who I've Saved Name For, which is the name of the exhibit, a collection of 6 canvases that feature Damacion's poems and an excerpt from Audre Lorde's Poetry is Not a Luxury.
exhibit a textured perspective of Filipino America's narrative. Tell us a little bit about that.
You know what? I think the best way to do that, and what I haven't done so far, is I want to read one of his poems. So I think I'm going to read. So I've named this exhibit, and my thesis was also for those I've same name for, and that is named after one of his poems, For Those I've Same Name For. And the reason why I chose that poem in particular was because for me, it was again like him just like almost him hinting at hopefulness and optimism, like maybe this isn't going to happen in my own lifetime, but I wish more for those I've same name for, aka my children. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't born yet when he wrote this poem. He didn't have children yet. But just the fact that he was thinking about the future and thinking forward was just like, even in itself, a small win for someone who just really felt uncomfortable in himself and in his own life. For him to be able to like have, some sort of hope for the future, to me was like something that I hold on to. So,
and something that you're really like, that's at the center of why you're carrying this word forward. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And because I also think of that, like in the context of like, this wasn't just particular to our family. This is like for Filipino Americans in general, even like we're not there yet. Like obviously we are not yet in the place as Filipino Americans, like you and I aren't seeing the type of celebration for Filipino America that we would want to see.
But we're getting there.
We're getting there.
And then, through efforts like these, which turn out to be really, really like great efforts. They're not just, a simple school project. Mm-hmm. This is obviously something you've put a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of thought, a lot of research into. This is years in the making, like you said. So, this is incredibly radical.
And obviously we're both mothers now. So now we're also thinking about the fact, like, I'm saying like, oh, my son is going to, be at this exhibit. Obviously your son now has, this data of you doing this podcast, and he can like look back on this and be like, oh, right. But so, he's not like the fact that they can see us taking ownership of our culture and our history as Filipino Americans in ways that we didn't see.
And our family story, more specifically, and how that plays into the larger story of Filipino American history, culture, etc.
And they can hopefully grow up loving being Filipino. That was something that I feel like I really grew into, and I like love being a Filipino American now. Like I think about that all the time. Like I love like meeting other Filipino Americans. Like I love being Fil-Am, like especially, finding a community. Once again, we're blessed to be in the Bay Area where that's prevalent. And like we have organizations like Solo Filipinas and, different Asian American organizations where being Asian American and being Filipino American is celebrated.
Yeah.
And that's just really cool. Like, we always knew other Filipino Americans. Like, you and I met each other in high school. We weren't the first Filipino Americans we had ever met, but I think even
people weren't like connected.
Yeah, over that. Like, oh yeah, you are and I am. But now it's like something that you go out of your way to search for and to just like create community through. It's like, that's really cool. Okay, so looking for this. For those I've saved names for. Each evening home from the paint factory, I spill the coins from my pockets onto the kitchen table. Then listen carefully as each coin tinks to the bottom of the mason jar. I am yet without a wife, but 4 large jars filled with copper and silver wait on the kitchen shelf like children. I hoard spare change for those I've already saved names for, unborn. Soberano, sovereign, for lands I might have conquered. And luz, meaning light, a vision at dusk of my young girl running ahead of me on the playground, riding straight into a hoop of sun. My father's name I hesitate to use. Remembering his comings home from the orchard to the table, dirty and bone-tired, a man who believed his own life for. Under the naked light bulb, he worried how to feed his 7 children. Father, who repeated to convince himself, we are something, we are something. Surrounded by his children, his pockets empty. Wow.
That was really beautiful.
Yeah.
I feel like that gives a lot of insight into like your creativity too. Like, I don't know. I just heard your voice in like the way that he, what do you call it? Like the words that he chooses is very much like how you talk to, even if it is, the tone is melancholy.
Yeah.
It's very like, I definitely see you in that.
And that's something I think about too, that like, obviously makes me sad as I think about the fact that, my son will have never met his grandfather. We will have never met my father. And there are very few people in my life who really, like, honestly knew him. And I know you've met him before, but, like, you, like, really didn't, know my father at all. And so, like, I think that was a part of this mission, too, was to, like, just continue his life and, like, make him feel like, he's still here and is known. And, like, I wanted to breathe, obviously, life into him for, my own personal, like, sentimental reasons. But also, like, I feel in some ways just like, especially because he passed when I was still relatively young, I was 21 years old. And I feel like, and this is something Denise and I have had conversations about, where she said to me before, like, I feel like it would explain so much more of you if I had known like who your father was.
Exactly.
And I think like it gives me context, and it like makes me feel like strengthened and fortified to feel like, okay, like this is a part of my identity. This is a part of who I was. And I think about that specifically because we're biracial. And, you know, we've talked about this before, like my Filipino side was, you know, the lifeblood through that was through my connection to my father, who is no longer here. And so to really like reaffirm, like, you know, I'm Filipino American, like, you know, I'm an artistic, I'm a creative, I'm all these things. And that came, you know, from so much from him. Yeah. And so to like, you know, breathe that context back into the world, I feel like it helps, just like, it makes me feel more connected here. Yeah.
Yeah.
And myself, because I'm like, I am all these things, but sometimes, you know, and I'm sure, you know, we've had these conversations where it's like, you know, I am Filipino, but like, you know, am I? You know, like,
yeah,
you know, like,
there's been a big question mark around what does that even mean?
Yeah.
And I think you've always had access to your dad's poetry. Obviously, I'm sure this is not the first time you were reading it, but to do all the research that you did, to have the personal experiences that you did that informed, you know, that fueled you to want to read it again from a different perspective and say, again, how do I use this work that reflects such a depressive time and a melancholy tone and all of that in a thesis project, aka a message that I'm declaring or arguing is important from a celebratory nature. Like, that's a huge challenge. And he set you up for success to do that by birthing you, which he's talking about in this poem, which is so beautiful because
he didn't even know he was going to have a daughter.
Exactly.
Like, I love that.
That's wild.
To know that.
The vision of the daughter jumping into the sun is like, I saw you as a little kid with a little red hair, like, running, you know.
Yeah, same. And that's I think also why, you know, I chose this poem in particular, because it says so much that, you know, he was hopeful, and the fact that when he thinks about his kids and he was being optimistic and he was hopeful, he was thinking about daughters, and he ended up having 2 daughters, my sister, myself. And like, this is prior to him knowing my mom or anything.
Like, it's what do you call it? Like a little bit psychic?
Yeah.
Or like, is it psychic or telepathic? What's the word that I'm looking for?
It's
like very, that's so Raven.
Exactly. It's like, that's exactly the formal terminology.
That's the vibe.
So, yeah. And just like that manifestation, that whole, what is that? Like art, like inspiring life, inspiring art, whatever, like art mimicking life, etc. Like, it's just really
reflecting.
Cool.
Yeah.
And that he did that, and now I'm doing that. And like that,
and he had no idea that this was going to reach the audience that it is now reaching.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
well, congrats. This is huge.
Thank you.
And I can't wait for the launch.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
What is that event going to entail, and what are the future plans for this exhibit?
So the launch, and I was very, very intentional about this. P and I, my partner, went back and forth about like, okay, I want to do this pop-up exhibit. You know, we're here in the Bay Area. Should it be in Oakland or should it be in San Francisco? You know, I obviously went to SF State. You know, it was a possibility. I could reach out to my professors and like really like, you know, argued for it to be at San Francisco State.
Yeah.
But I was like, no, like I want us to be in Oakland. Like I want people to come to Oakland. Like I want a celebration in Oakland. And to me, when I think about Oakland, like I think of really like the history, and this is what we're going to talk about. Part of the conversation when we have this event, the event is both a pop-up and then it's a reception. So then we're going to have a conversation. There's going to be a poetry reading from this Pinay poet who's going to read some of my father's poetry as well. But it's all going to be centered in Oakland. And the reason why, you know, I felt so strongly about that was not just because I love Oakland, but because of Oakland's specific history of ethnic organizing, ethnic empowerment, like, and intersectional organizing. Obviously, there's the Black Panthers, but, you know, Oakland's Chinatown has a storied history. You know, I'm from the East Bay, like, clearly, you know, my family is from Fairfield. And so, like, it just really meant a lot to me to just really center, like, intercultural celebration and organizing here in Oakland, where I feel like it's really pertinent, and it is to this day. It's going to be in a Black-owned space, which is at Kinfolks. He grew up with one of the owners, so it's just like, okay, like all these things are just interconnecting. And then I was just thinking about, you know, my own network, and like I'm thinking about like people like, you know, that were like Steve and shit, and I'm like, I really want him to come to Oakland. Like I want to give them like a little bit of like just like the
experience.
The experience Oakland provide. And what's been really cool is like as I've been passing out these flyers, A lot of people recognize kinfolks, and they recognize kinfolks specifically because it is this community space. And that's what I love about Oakland, is that it's a coffee place and a wine bar, but then also they're really intentional about creating community, and they have a bunch of conversations and events about that are specifically related to, like ethnic organizing and, cultural building and movements. And I was like, this
basically
is
the part of your thesis.
Exactly. Yeah. And I was like, okay, this is perfect. And it's going to take place in October, which is Filipino American History Month. And that's also my dad's birthday month. So his birthday is the 16th. This event is going to be on the 11th. And so I just feel like, this is like perfect timing. And my hope, so it's a multimedia exhibit where there's going to be 6 poems that were centered in my thesis are going to be on prints, which are overlaid on photographs from our own family archive. So he was also a photographer as well as a poet. And then there's this one picture, which I'm using across all of the media, which is a famous picture within my own family. It's this picture of him and this little white boy in Oklahoma drinking a beer.
Is it in here?
It's this picture, yeah.
The framed one?
The framed picture that's in my bathroom that has followed me,
Well, I'm not going to show it because it's cut off.
It's cut off. But so this is the setup. If you go on the Eventbrite, doors open at 6. We're going to do a little mingle, go see the exhibit. And then, so it's the poetry on top of these archival photos. And then there's a little QR code. Scan the QR code, and it takes you to the website that, for those I sing name4.com. And then that's where my essays that are pulled and inspired from my thesis. They're not exactly taken from my thesis because I wasn't totally happy with it. I was just trying to graduate at that point. So I just fucking turned in whatever.
Yeah.
So I reworked the essays, but there's an essay where I give that history and that personal contextualization per each poem. And then I'm thinking, I haven't done this yet. This is very typical of me, down to the fucking wire, where I want to do a little video. I think I want to do a reading to make it inclusive. If you can't read or if you just don't feel like reading, I'm going to do the reading of my essay for you. So that's going to be from 6 to 7. 7, we're going to have the poetry reading. And then at about 7:30 to 8:30, I'm going to do a fireside chat with this adjunct lecturer of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State. His name is Francis Wong. But more than that, he's also a saxophonist, this really storied and celebrated jazz musician. And he is an OG Asian American organizer. So he did one of the walks to, what the fuck is it called? Abayani Village, the senior citizen village that Larry Itliong set up. Oh, he did a walk to that, the 70s or the 80s or some shit. And he was also friends with Steve. They went to Stanford together.
Oh my God.
Yeah, they participated in a very small world. And they participated in a South African anti-apartheid movement where, come to find out, that Nelson Mandela was literally still in fucking prison when we were born in the 1990s. They participated in protests against that to help, liberate him, liberate South Africa. And then they were also worked together on the Rainbow Coalition, which was Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign. So when I started working with Steve, he's a current client and he is close friends with Francis, who is still. Wow, and Francis, come to find out, he's a hidden, he was I met the person
Francis through Steve.
I met him through when I was working at the Chinese.
So this is literally just.
He's my own. Yeah, I knew him.
Wow. Literally, I can see the stars in the sky.
For this all to happen.
Yeah.
So when I was working at the Chinese Historical Society of America, which was also the impetus for me to really get interested in Asian American studies, because I was oh shit, look at our history, blah, blah, blah. I started doing some of the writing for our Facebook. I worked at this museum, this small museum about Chinese Americans, and one of our historic Chinatowns. I think San Francisco's Chinatown is the oldest Chinatown in America. But I started doing some of the copy and the writing for our social media. So on the Tumblr and Facebook and shit. And he was
not Tumblr. No,
I love Tumblr.
Does Tumblr?
I'm bringing Tumblr back.
Does anybody use Tumblr?
I do.
Oh.
Well, I don't right now, but I will.
Okay.
And he was hey, who's doing our writing? And then someone was that's Caitlin. And I'm he was oh, hey, I really like, what you're doing. Cause it was during the Donald Trump administration and all this anti-immigration work that he was doing when he was calling, certain countries shithole countries and we don't want them coming in here, blah, blah, blah. And Chinese Americans were the first to be specifically excluded by law from entry into America with the Chinese Exclusion Act. I believe it was in 1882. And so Chinese Americans really took front and center to kind of oppose Donald Trump's administration on that point. And so I was doing some writing and activism around that. And then that's when Francis and I created this bond. And then he ended up writing my reference to San Francisco State for the humanities program. So he helped me get into San Francisco State.
Gotcha.
And now I've graduated and it's coming full circle now.
Because you just happen to be working, or your client happens to be one of his college friends.
No. I was working Francis and I worked together at the same place. He worked at Chinese Historical Society as well.
Right. And now one of his college friends is your client.
But like, I knew him anyways. Like, I saw Steve interviewed Francis for his podcast, and I was like, oh, you know Francis? And he was like, bitch, you know Francis? He was about to be 28. How do you know him? And I was like, oh, that's like my guy.
It's like my mentor.
He wrote my reference.
Yeah.
Like, how the fuck do you know him? And so, yeah, so now we're doing this, and like, come to find out, like, he's like this OG. So like, I've been doing like work in Chinatown and like with the Korean Street Workshop and like these different affiliations and organizations recently, just like as I'm trying to, like build up like kind of buzz for this pop-up. And everyone's like when I've been saying, oh yeah, and like, I'm doing this and that, and I'm going to have I just have been like throwing his name out there just to see what happens. They're like, you know Francis Wong? Like, even when I was doing my interview for Center for Asian American Media, like the executive director was in one of the group interviews.
Yes, flex.
And then I said like, oh, like, and I don't know if you know this guy, like Francis Wong. And he was like, that's my friend. He's performing at like my retirement party.
Well,
I was like, well, guess what? He's my bestie. He's my BFF. So come and find out.
So what would you like to offer me?
Yeah. So like, yeah, like,
okay, Francis, come through.
And I'm excited because he's just like hella chill.
I want to be Francis now.
I want to know his friend. Like, if you're Asian American and you care about doing stuff in Asian American activism or organizing, you should know Francis. I'm going to be happy to introduce you. Like,
okay.
I've actually mentioned you before the TFAW project when I've spoken with him, but like, come to find out, like, he's like the perfect flex card. Like, if you feel the need to like, mention Francis Wong. So yeah, I've been doing that. And like, now my hope is that like, so you asked like, okay, what's going to be the life and the progression of this project that I'm doing? My hope is that, I'm going to do the debut of this exhibit here in Oakland. And then I'm working with a SF State faculty member on, at the event. And then I'm hoping like, okay, next will move to San Francisco. It'll be at San Francisco State University. And once I get into a university, then I'm hoping like other professors will be like, oh, I have colleagues who work, East Bay or Sacramento or UCLA, UC Irvine. And that's my hope, is that it'll kind of like jump around. Just once again, take up space, Filipino American stories out here. And then I will also use that, as like basically to build in and bake in my resume for application for ethics studies program. So now I'm finally ready to enter ethics studies now that I put to bed, my call to action in the humanities program and like really proving a point that like, you should also be teaching ethics studies in the humanities. Now I really want to take the time to study ethics studies by itself.
Yeah.
Right.
You've done that and you've built a bridge for your next step.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking about like the next step, My mom moves back into our home in Fairfield after her divorce. And then I remember when I was in high school, I have a core memory of my dad and I going back to our home in Fairfield, and he's just like getting some of his stuff to like bring into his apartment. And he's like pulling his records and shit. And then they get into an argument because she essentially just like accuses him of like stealing her shit. And he's like, these are my fucking jazz records. Like, what do you mean? Like, you do know who like fucking Miles Davis is? Like, mom and whatever. And so he's like, get her out of my sight. So I'm like, Grandma, I'm hungry. Like, he made me so much. So I was
trying to create a diversion.
Like, okay, I'm hungry. And so she makes me ponce on top of rice, which is the only way to fucking eat ponce in my opinion. And so she's like, cooking me lunch. And then she's like, Caitilin, do you have a boyfriend? And I'm like, okay, Grandma, let's get into it.
I feel like her and I would jive.
She was nothing like your grandma. Your grandma, like, what's
like my grandma, but me and her. Like, the way that I'm so blinded.
I could see you being my grandma. Anyway, okay, Grandma is cooking me lunch, and she's like, Caitilin, you have a boyfriend? And I'm like, yes, Grandma, I have a boyfriend. And then she goes, what is he? And I'm like, oh my God, that's the moment. We're about to find out if my grandma's racist. Guess what, Grandma? He's black.
With the dramatic effect.
He's black. And he's from Oakland, and I love it.
And here's your microphone. What's your response?
Her response is so classic. Why not white? She doesn't even say, why not Filipino? She doesn't say, why? She just say, why not white? And the reason why she says that is because she grew up in this country specifically seeing that white supremacy very much is a thing, and it really does take you to the top because, well, that's exactly what white supremacy is, like white is right and everything else. And so she was like, why not white? And I felt her on that because I was like, I see where you're coming from, but guess what? I don't even remember what I said. I think I was just like, like,
Yeah.
why are you doing that? It's like gross. And at this time, she had been divorced, but now she had picked up a new boyfriend who my dad...
Again?
This is a new boyfriend, Jim, white. They met at the senior home. She likes to dance. He was a musician.
Did I know her?
My grandpa or my dad fucking hated him. We went to lunch one time. We went on a double date. Well, it wasn't a double date. I was with my dad and my sister. And we go with my grandma and her boyfriend to the Dead Fish.
Oh, I love that. Was Papa's favorite restaurant.
Because it's a fucking great restaurant.
Every birthday for him.
Yeah,
we still go there for his birthday.
We should go there. Like, we should die for Tina Tandy, but he's like, why do you want to go to the Dead Fish? And I'm like, why don't you want to go to the Dead Fish?
It's actually...
It's like a Michelin star restaurant.
Yeah.
But anyway, but he's like feeding her like at lunch.
Yeah.
He's like stuffing calamari in my grandma's like 85-year-old mouth. And my dad is like, and while he's doing it, he's also like low-key talking shit about Filipinos. Like,
Okay, so it was
like, oh, my Filipino girl, like,
yeah,
he did.
Yeah, he's like objectifying.
Yeah, he's objectifying her
in real time in front of her family.
Yeah, in front of her family.
Yeah,
she doesn't give a fuck because she's just like, I just want to dance and date one guy. I don't care. What.
Relatable, grandma.
Like, do you? And that's and afterwards, like, when we were in the parking lot, my dad is like fucking pissed and he's like venting. And my mom is just like she was just,
oh my God, your mom was there.
And
did she say anything at the table?
She's just trying to be like, oh, like, that's so nice for you, Luz, that you're happy and like you're dating. Cause like, what, as opposed to what, Dad? Like, you want her to fucking sit alone in her house and like just fucking die and like be miserable? Like, no, she wants to dance. She wants to wear her sequin jumpsuits and go out. Like, let her do that. And so, yeah, that was like grandma in a fucking nutshell. And so but that was a core memory to me.
Okay, wait. In the next iteration of this exhibit and this project, I was focused on grandma because like now my interest is piqued.
All my like grandma Luz, tell me more.
If I can relate, I'm sure a lot of our listeners can.
That was so good.
That was good. That was such a thorough review. Like, I have been by your side through this whole process, obviously, and I had zero idea of like the monumental work that you are putting in to get through this. I mean, obviously you've told me, but things don't really hit the way that they do when you connect all the dots the way we just did. And so like, I have to let this marinate personally for me to really let it soak in. Like, wow, this was a huge feat.
Yeah.
And you should feel really accomplished. You should feel so proud of yourself. You should feel so like, this is huge, not just for you and your career and your personal, like, cathartic process again, but for your son, for your dad, even for your mom, who's the only one that witnessed a lot of the things that you're bringing to light now. And your grandparents who you didn't get to have these conversations with, like, this is really huge. So I just want to end on that note. And I'm sure that our listeners will feel this too, because I'm sure a lot of people have the same experience of feeling really disconnected from their family and not really understanding how, their family's migration stories and what the experience was of assimilating in America, because a lot of the older generations just didn't want to talk about it. Like you said, they just weren't in a space to be able to talk about it. They're dealing with undiagnosed PTSD, not even having a clue what PTSD is, right?
Yeah.
And so for you to go and do, dig up all of this research, dig up all of these records that give you insight that even if they were alive and you could have these conversations, you wouldn't have gotten because they wouldn't have opened up in this way. A lot of people can feel that. Yeah. And you doing that work for your family, I'm sure is going to fill in the gap for a lot of people who also had that missed opportunity. Yeah. So thank you for sharing all of it.
Thank you for just like creating the space for me to like be, for us to have these therapy sessions essentially about like, our background. But I feel like I've learned so much specifically about like my own family history and like about being Filipino through this project. And I know that's what people tell you guys all the time. It's like, oh wow, like I really like, learned a lot about myself just like by hearing you guys talk about your own process. So, it's cool that you guys have always created this space. And just,
I think for a lot of people, when you're doing it in an isolated way and you're not sharing with others and you're not talking about it and you don't feel comfortable, in social discourse talking about it,
it feels very arbitrary and meaningless, which is also the vibe that I was getting from, your dad's poems and his early experience. Is like, what the fuck is this? Yeah. What am I even doing this for? You know what I mean? And how you ended it with the poem that you read is like, I'm doing this for people I don't fucking know.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't even know if I'm going to have kids, but if I do,
here you go.
This is my gift to them. And I think that embodies a lot of how we all feel about like, do I know what it means to be Filipino American? How do I define that? What informs the way I define that? Like, what meaning am I making of my experience? Yeah. And I think that's the question at the heart of your project, of this project. Our new tagline is strengthening Filipino voices, one conversation at a time. And I love that we're getting to open, returning to this podcast with your thesis project.
That we're doing it together.
Yeah, that we're doing it together, but more importantly, you're doing it with your dad, who's not even here. Yeah. Like, you guys are connecting in a very, like, what do you call it, Spider-Man, like multiverse?
Yeah, like multiverse transcendent.
It's really cool.
Yeah, and then just, I get once again that, like, to your point, like, it does feel very, like, written, on the stars, or, like, written before us, that, all this is also coming to a head right before his birthday, and I'm very much planning, to go drive out to Fairfield and to go visit Rockville Cemetery and to sit down. Because I haven't done that in so long, and to really take the time, like, I haven't done that since I've graduated, to let him know, like, you were my thesis, to let him know that you're now being taught, SFSU, that I'm doing this pop-up, and what's also, like, really cool is that, so my grandma died the Monday after he died. So he died on the Monday, she died the Monday after, and they were buried together in the same plot. So she was buried, and, like, the last conversation I had with my grandma, we had my dad cremated, and at his funeral service, like, me and her got into an argument because she came up to me afterwards and she was like, why did you cremate him? And I was like, Grandma, I literally don't have the fucking time for this. My eyes are bloodshot. You just heard me crying in front of a room full of people for the last hour. Like, I don't want to talk about this right now. She was so fucking mad that I had him cremated. Yeah. That we had him cremated, because it's not, like, a Catholic thing to do. Yeah. But it ended up working out because, like, now he's buried at, like, he's in a little box at the head of her gravesite, and they're right next to my grandfather. Yeah. So, like, the three of them are all there, right there, and they were obviously such, an integral part of this process and my thesis. And like you said, like, now I am very much, like, fascinated about just my grandma in general. Like, there's a lot more I want to discover there. So
I definitely wish you knew her.
Yeah, I wish I knew her better. Like, now, what this has also taught me is, like, all of my aunts and uncles are very much still alive, and a lot of them are still in Fairfield. So I want to, dig up their oral stories and, like, I want to know more about my grandma in particular. So why don't you invite them to do that? And some of them are coming out. My cousins, for sure. Some of my cousins are coming. Yeah. I don't know so much about my aunties. My aunt, who is not related, she's an aunt by marriage, who is also my dad's best friend, she's gonna come. But it'll be great to see, like, if, like, some of my, like, blood relatives come out and, like, during the Fairfield
and feel inspired to uncover some new, like,
more conversations, like, more bonding moments too.
Yeah, obviously that was not the only perspective available. Right. Like, they were there too.
They were there. So they lived there. They knew him.
It would be lovely to know what you think of this, or what you have to ask.
I'm nervous, but, like, I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, you can't expect everything to be, like, good feedback, but nonetheless.
Yeah, there you go. Facts. So we'll see.
Okay, well, beautiful. I'm excited for the event, and we'll include snippets again from the live footage and all of the fun stuff. So you guys will get a comprehensive view of everything we're doing here. But thank you.
Oh, thank you. I love you. I love you so much. And thank you guys for being here on this journey.
We'll see you later.
Hey, thanks for listening to the TFAW Project with your co-hosts, Jen Amos and Nani Dominguez-Smith. This show was produced by Jen Amos, written by Nani Dominguez-Smith, and edited by Dennis Ragalado. If you enjoy our show and want to join our mission of strengthening Filipino voices, we encourage you to join our family on thenewfilipina.com. All right, we'll see you in thenewfilipina.com, or we'll catch you in the next conversation. Bye for now.